Well, after all these years, it's really extraordinary to be playing the Bruckner Ninth Symphony with a finale. And to understand why we do it and what this finale is, we have to go quite far back into history. In the 1890s, when Bruckner was writing his Ninth Symphony, he was not in good health, either physically or psychologically. But at the same time, he was writing transcendent music and writing music in a new voice and a new language, more revolutionary and more extreme than he'd ever written before. There's a kind of myth that there are only sketches left of the last movement. In fact, there was really an emerging full score there, complete almost to the end. Now, to understand the way Bruckner works, you have to think in terms of an architect as much as a composer. As far as I know, he's the only composer who would decide on the length of his movement and then simply put all the bars on manuscript, not only numbered, but also numbered in phrase lengths before any note was in there. So it's like the blueprint of a great cathedral. And so actually, even when there are some empty pages, we know exactly how many bars there were and what kind of phrases there were. When Bruckner was dying, he had many visitors wanting to come to see him for the last time. And also his body was left in his apartment for a couple of days for people to come and view it. The extraordinary and ghoulish truth is that people quite often took pages of the manuscript of the Ninth Symphony as souvenirs, particularly of the finale. But of course, one or two had no notes on them. They thought, oh, well, this is fine. But some of them, of course, had notes. And it may be that there is still some of Bruckner's music hidden in people's attics or in manuscript collections somewhere. What is absolutely without doubt is that if he had lived another 2 months, he would have completed the whole finale, including the orchestration. What we have is a score where almost everything is there. At the very beginning, all the orchestration. Later on, most of the string parts. And there are other sketches and continuity drafts that he did, which you can piece together in a kind of jigsaw and make the finale that he always dreamt about. And just to give you an idea, if there are about 650 bars in the finale, 600 are clearly written by Bruckner. And these 4 wonderful musicians who worked on the finale for so many years said at the end they had to compose only 28 bars using material that was already there. But let's just go back into history. One thing Bruckner struggled with all his life was his very, very well-meaning disciples. They loved him, they understood a certain amount about his music, but like almost everybody in this time, they saw music through the prism of Wagner. They wanted his music to be more like Wagner's. When it was, this was absolutely fine. When it was not, they very often persuaded him to change what he'd already written. Bruckner, being a man of paradoxically enormous strength but very little self-confidence, very often gave in to them. Now with the Ninth Symphony, there was not even a Bruckner to argue with. his pupils, and particularly Löwe, who did an incredible service to him in every way, took the completed or nearly completed manuscripts of the first three movements and thought that the elderly composer had simply lost his mind. Because, of course, the music is much more forward-looking than anything he had ever written. Very dissonant, often very stark and very despairing music. So Löwe decided to improve it in the way that Rimsky-Korsakov decided to improve Mussorgsky's original Boris Godunov. And not only did he reorchestrate it so it sounded like a Goethe-Dämmerung, but he also reharmonized it to take all the edges out. This was the version that was always played. It was only in 1933 in Munich when an enterprising conductor put on a simply astonishing concert, which was in the first half Bruckner's Ninth Symphony in Löwe's censored version, you might call it, and in the second half, the original version. And this was, of course, like seeing not only a painting restored, but finally the real painting. And from that historical concert onwards, people realized that there was only one Bruckner Ninth you could play. But of course, people looking at the finale through the prism of a censored, rearranged, reorchestrated three movements said, well, of course, this is nothing like the other movements. Bruckner must be losing his powers. It's too strange, it's too dissonant. This cannot be right. And of course, there was also an extraordinary charm in having yet another unfinished symphony. After Schubert's unfinished symphony, which had been rediscovered so many years after his death. What's amusing is, until about the last 30 years, we used to play also a slightly censored version of the Schubert unfinished symphony, is that the first editors took out some of the stranger dissonances. And even when I was a child, this censored version of the Schubert was what was played. So there's a link again to the Bruckner. But people loved the idea also that you can't get beyond the ninth. Every composer was terrified of the ninth. Mahler even wrote Das Lied von der Erde as his Ninth Symphony, thinking he could trick fate by calling his Ninth Symphony something else. So we're left with a situation where for generations everybody got used to the idea of three movements which were somehow perfection in themselves, even though a symphony that starts in D minor and ends in E major would be unthinkable, even to a composer as radical as Bruckner was becoming. Bruckner always meant this to be a four-movement symphony. He struggled to the end of his life to absolutely complete his finale. He even suggested at the end his Te Deum, which ends at a blaze of C major, could be tacked on as a finale. But beautiful though the Te Deum is, it has no place in this symphony. So, move forward 80 years, 90 years or so. A young Australian called John Phillips finally did all the work of collating what was there. And as with the case with what was considered to be the unfinished Mahler 10th Symphony, he and everybody else who looked at it was staggered how much Bruckner there was. And it's what I would call forensic musicology. It's a little bit like CSI. It's not only seeing what is there, It is seeing what else can go into there. And in a way, like reconstructing someone's face in surgery after a fire or an accident, you can see, okay, now this needs to go there, and this would be there if we had that. It helps that Bruckner wrote finales in such a similar way. There are basically two models for his finale, and this is a model more like the 5-part model of the Eighth Symphony, for instance. And so even when there are a few bars missing, you can tell what they would be. When it comes to the end of the symphony, the last 2 minutes maybe, where we really had no notes, we, thank goodness, have one extraordinary eyewitness account. Bruckner would often play the finale on the organ to his friends, and we have a very detailed account of what he played at the end of the finale, which was that all the main themes of the movements were to be superimposed, as they are at the end of the eighth. And people always stopped at this point because they thought, well, no one can do this. These four very enterprising musicians who worked on it said, this should be not beyond the realms of human imagination to reconstruct. And they found, to their amusement, that was easier than some of the other work they had to do, because there was simply only one way in which these themes could go together. They also knew that at the end of every symphony there is a chorale which goes towards heaven. They knew that Bruckner never ended a symphony in a minor key. And they realized that the chorale, which is very much part of the last movement, saturated with the idea of death, could not be this. But the great chorale in the slow movement on the trumpets, da 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 da, excuse my singing, would do this. And therefore, in some ways, the very ending almost wrote itself. So, what to say about the finale now? If you have got used to the 3-movement Bruckner symphony and you feel that the slow movement ends in tranquility, looking back lovingly at his previous works, then the finale will come as a shock. However, what is really astonishing is that after the searing climax of the Adagio, which ends on a dissonance which was never in classical music before, a dissonance so extreme that of course it was reharmonized at the turn of the century, that then the music goes back to the beginning of the Adagio again and starts moving on at exactly the same tempo. And listened through the idea of a 4-movement piece, what is very clear is that the end of the Adagio is sending out signals which must be resolved by a huge finale. Now, the finale is built on very, very disciplined material, particularly this characteristic dotted rhythm, ya, da-da, 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 da-da. It happens again and again in an almost obsessive way. There is a second theme subject which has the same kind of harmony, which is very cold, very lost, a type of music that Bruckner also never wrote before. There's an extraordinary double fugue where he uses the material and he concentrates it, and it has all the bursting energy of a supernova. And there is, of course, this overarching sense that we will get somewhere, and that even in the face of death and adversity, there will be triumph. And the end, this characteristic Alleluia of Bruckner, feels absolutely right. One of the things I said to the orchestra when we first played it is, please do not judge this until you've played it a few times. Because my experience in working on it earlier this year with the Bundesjugendorchester is that every time you hear it, it seems more and more convincing. And as Nicholas Harnoncourt says, we have a long playing tradition for the first three movements. We have no playing tradition for the finale. We have to make it up as we go. And the strangest music in the finale is no stranger than the strangest music in the rest of the piece. One has to get used also to the idea of Bruckner making dissonances that sound more like Schoenberg than what you would have expected from Bruckner. Realizing that a lot of Bruckner's music, his earlier music at least, was built on leaps of a fifth or an octave, you find yourself in a completely different world when the Adagio, for instance, starts not with an octave, but with almost a scream of pain of a ninth, one more. So the kind of phrase that Mahler would later, much later, use so often. And for instance, in the finale, there is an extraordinary use of the ninth, of this terrible, searing dissonance in the trumpets, which scream out a kind of fanfare instead of the usual this. They play again the ninth. This kind of dissonance comes again and again in the last movement, and it's very uncomfortable listening, and it's meant to be uncomfortable listening. It's as though the entire fabric of the music is being pulled to pieces. For all of us, this is an extraordinary adventure, an extraordinary journey, not the least physically, because suddenly a symphony which was 60 minutes long becomes 83 minutes long, and it's a very different thing. But it has an extraordinarily satisfying shape to it. And what a luck, what a joy for us to be playing for the first time a whole new symphonic movement by Bruckner, late Bruckner, and vintage, wonderful Bruckner at that. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you will really listen to it, and I hope you will enter into hearing it with the kind of openness that we have had to play it with. I would love also to pay tribute to the four extraordinary musicians who have done this almost unparalleled work of reconstruction. And just leave you with one thought. There is much, much, much more Bruckner in this than, for instance, in the Mozart Requiem. For years we've been playing the Mozart Requiem. Now it's time that more often we heard what we can hear of Bruckner's real conception of his last final masterpiece.